Singapore generated about 6.94 million tons of solid waste last year, according to the National Environment Agency. And just about more than half of this was recycled. The recycling recycling rate for plastic was 6% last year. So, Geoffrey, if I can ask you, how big is Singapore's waste problem at this point, and what is the government doing about moving from a linear to a circular economy?
Yeah, thanks, Ishika, for the question. I think as a small, low-lying country, definitely circularity and closing the waste loop is a key strategic priority for Singapore. And the government has been looking at circularity, the green economy, for some time. I think, in fact, the water story is a good example, right? I think our Public Utilities Board has done a great job in closing the water loop by looking at new technologies like new water, desalination. But beyond water, I think there are new constraints. And plastic waste, e-waste, I think these are the new challenges that we need to deal with. And the Singapore government has put in place certain plans and strategies to deal with this. I think a good milestone in our circular economy journey is the launch of the Zero Waste Master Plan back in 2019. And essentially that plan looks at and identified key waste streams, food waste, plastic waste, e-waste, as you mentioned, and really how do we tackle these waste streams and how do we reduce the waste that goes to our landfills. So that's the Zero Waste Master Plan, and I think more recently, last year, the government announced the Singapore Green Plan. And as part of that plan, which basically is a whole of government plan towards sustainable development, there are strategies and pillars that looks at circularity. How do we deal with our waste streams? How do we promote sustainable living through recycling and better managing our waste resources?
Joyce, if I could bring you in at this point, you've helped launch quite a few accelerators around sustainability, smart cities across Southeast Asia. Can you tell us about Hyperscale and StartupX and what work you're doing in that space?
Yeah, so StartupX, we're an innovation company, and we work with partners, we work with government agencies and corporates to basically drive innovation with startups. And part of what we do then is launching accelerators across different verticals. And one of the very big areas then is in sustainability. So we are working with Geoffrey's team to look at waste management, and we are working with startups from all around the globe that are tackling plastic waste and e-waste, both upstream and downstream across the entire waste value chain. We want to be able to actually work with them and get them to work with our partners to drive more innovation in the waste sector.
What kinds of solutions have you come across at this point in the waste tech space?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So if you look at across the entire waste value chain, the waste sector is one where it requires sometimes quite deep-seated expertise. Yeah. And it's hard for any young startup founder to come in and say, I want to build great things in the waste sector, because they might lack the domain expertise to actually do more things in this space. So a lot of them, a lot of the startups that we work with, they concentrate upstream, which is looking at product redesign, alternative packaging, sustainable packaging, and so on. But we also do come across quite a number of maybe founders that are a little bit more mature, that have a number of years in the waste sector, and they are able to see what are the pain points in these sectors, and they want to tackle that. So you do see companies that are tackling much further downstream, that are looking at basically waste treatment, waste sorting, automated sorting, and so on, that are actually interested to work with the waste managers, incumbent waste managers, to collaborate and do more in this space.
I guess. Oh, would you like to add?
No, I was just jumping quickly, and I think beyond what Joyce mentioned, I think definitely we see a shift towards just demand for simple waste management solutions, right? Towards really circular solutions. And I think what's quite in demand, especially in our region, is towards areas like resource circularity. How do we close the waste loop? How do we create more resilient resources? And we see technologies and companies within some of these technologies. Yeah.
So I suppose as a government, you're going to have to deal with a lot of competing interests, especially as ESG becomes a bigger part of many discussions that you're having. How much is the government really willing to, allocate to the circular economy right now?
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't put a specific number, but if I just reference Singapore government's research, innovation, and enterprise strategy and budget, right? Almost, I think, 400 million has been allocated towards decarbonization and circularity. And there is an 80 million sort of funding for a close the loop sort of initiative as well. So I think there's adequate monies that are being channeled towards this area.
I mean, we're in really very early stages right now when it comes to transitioning to a circular economy. As a startup, practically, as a startup founder, what can I do in terms of working with the government in Singapore or working with big businesses here in the country to help them make that transition?
Can I take this?
You can go first.
Well, I think the role of partnerships is definitely critical in this transition towards a circular economy. And the partnerships can come in the form of public-private partnerships, as well as collaborations between large corporates, MNCs, and small companies, SMEs and startups. And I think the government plays a role not just in funding, right, but also in creating these platforms. As an example, Enterprise Singapore, we have launched a series of sustainability open innovation challenges that really works with and identifies corporates, get them to identify their challenge statements, and work with startups to sort of co-create and innovate circular solutions. And in these platforms, I think that's where the startups can leverage the resources of the MNCs and the corporates, whether it's in funding, mentorship, test bedding facilities, as an example.
Yeah. So if so we are part of an alliance called the Sustainability and Innovation Alliance. The alliance has just celebrated its first year anniversary. And at the core of the alliance, and there's about 700 plus members and advocates from all around the world that's a part of this alliance. And at the very core of it is the idea that collaboration is the way to go for sustainable innovation. It doesn't matter whether you are a startup founder or an investor or corporate innovator or regulator. The core of it is not about disrupting. It's actually about collaborating together so that we can drive more sustainable innovation. And I think, whether you are an academic that's trying to create research in this space, or you're a startup founder that's trying to build more sustainable solutions, you have to learn to figure out how to actually work with the regulators better. You have to learn how to work with the corporates better. And we need to establish what is that easier framework for people to collaborate better so that they can bring together more sustainable practices. And that's what we try to do. Through the accelerator, then, the idea is that at the end of the day, we want to be able to connect the startup founders and the solutions that they have together with the waste management incumbents so that they can actually collaborate and they can actually pilot their solutions together in the industry. And the way that we want to do it is to facilitate an easier way and an easier approach to do that. So I think the bottom line is understanding it from a collaboration perspective, and then things can flow better.
Which sectors are sort of facing the most pressure right now in terms of making that transition? In Singapore or in Southeast Asia?
The corporates are facing a lot of the pressure.
Yeah, which industries?
Which industries? Yeah. I do think overall there are, well, if you look at it from, let's say, the consumer's consciousness about things, more and more consumers are demanding that the brands that they purchase from, they have to be sustainable. And because of that, and at the same time, then there are also the regulators, and maybe Geoffrey is best placed to answer this. There are also the regulators who are saying, hey, there are certain areas. For example, if you are an e-waste producer, you have to be a lot more uptight about how you are generating all of these waste and what you're doing about it, and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, they're also facing pressure from their shareholders who say, hey, we have to look at the bottom line. When we introduce sustainable practices, or when we, do something, that's in the sustainability domain, what does it mean for our bottom line? And also, what does it mean for our brand image? So there are definitely different industries. I would say right now in Singapore, the hardware companies, for example, is one of the industries that are, a little bit more maybe conscious about the kind of waste that they are generating. Then also, if you look at real estate players, facilities management, hotels and so on, that's also another industry that is also starting to be a lot more conscious about, for example, the waste that they create.
Yeah, and just to add on that, you mentioned regulation. So, of course, for specific areas where there is a need to intervene, I think in e-waste, extended producer responsibility frameworks, right, regulations have been put in place really to sort of put the onus on the producers to be more mindful of the e-waste that they create. And that's one key area. And the idea, of course, is to extend this to other waste streams. I think packaging is another a key area, which basically cuts across many different industries and sectors as well, which the government is trying to address. Yeah.
Okay, I think at this point we can bring up the Twitter poll that we had in the lead up to the summit, where we asked the Twitterverse, has the pandemic really helped or hurt Asia's move towards transitioning from a linear to a circular economy? And if we could bring the results up, that would be great. But what we found was that 81.5% of the Twitterverse actually said it hurt the move, whereas 18.5% said it helped. Unsurprising, right? I think at this point it would be nice to talk about the challenges in terms of doing this transition. So this involves a lot of costs for a company to bear, thinking about the materials they're using for their products, how to recycle it, how to reduce waste. How are they sort of navigating that at this point?
Well, maybe I'll cover it from maybe the consumer's perspective, because we do work with a lot of young startup founders. So at the height of the pandemic, we ran a hackathon where we actually invited all of these young participants to basically tackle challenges that were of very big issues to youth in Singapore today. And sustainability was one of the areas, future of work was one of the areas, and not surprisingly, most of them choose to work on future of work. It's almost as though, the past few years where people were very passionate about sustainability and they want to do more in this space, they put that aside because their most immediate concerns is their bread and butter.
Yeah.
And I think if you extrapolate that to the corporates, it's the same thing. Making sure that the business is secure, it's way more important, and because they have employees, they have so much considerations to think about before sustainability.
Right.
That has become something, of an afterthought. I think things are changing, and we see through our conversations with our partners that a lot of these are coming back. There are net zero targets that a lot of companies have set, by 2050, by 2030, and at the back of their minds, they do understand that is something that they have to work towards. But it's true, I do think that, as per the Twitter poll, it's definitely hurt the momentum that we had been on prior to the pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I think it's both hurt and helped, right? I think definitely the COVID and the pandemic resulted in companies taking their eye off that objective and really trying to survive and address business costs. But at the same time, I think during the pandemic, it has also created an awareness on the challenges that we faced in managing our waste. I think that there was a report that was talking about how COVID actually impacted the waste sector, because there's an increased frequency of waste, there's a shift towards municipal versus industrial waste, etc. And I think that's also the period where we see a lot of governments and industries realizing the waste problem. And that action needs to be taken. And basically that creates opportunities for economic opportunities and businesses, right? I think the challenges that businesses will face really depends on whether there are companies that are looking to adopt solutions and to be more sustainable and to be more circular, and different set of challenges that are faced for companies looking to innovate, right? I think for the ones that are looking to transit and be more circular in their practices, they're too used to the linear business model. I think there's a lack of awareness about circularity and the different business models. And the other hurdle really is the cost for them to adopt some of these solutions. For companies and startups that we work with that are looking to innovate and develop solutions, I think the typical R&D and product development risk remains. But I think there is that high investment cost that's required and a lot of uncertainty on whether these solutions will actually be adopted in the industry.
Right.
Yeah.
So as an investor, how can an investor tap this space right now? And greenwashing is such a big theme. How do they avoid that? Joyce, would you like to go?
I think the circularity space is one that that maybe many investors are still, I think, quite unsure about, because investors at the end of the day, they are looking at the ROI for their investments, and sometimes it's hard to sort of look at a circularity company and think about what that multiple could be if they invest in these companies. We often work with a lot of investors who tell us that they don't quite understand how to do the due diligence around these companies. There's not enough precedence in Asia as compared to, let's say, in Europe or US, for them to understand, how to best invest in these companies. At the same time, we do see, right now with Hyperscale, we're working with a number of impact investors that we are hoping at the end of the accelerator, some of the startups that come out through the accelerator could be potential investments for these investors. And at the same time, we are hoping to create more education for investors to sort of understand how they can be a part of sustainability investing. But it takes time to educate. And it takes time for, I think there is interest. There's interest from the family offices, there's interest from the corporate investors, there's interest from the venture capital companies. It's more about the education that needs to be there for them to understand how to invest in this space. A lot more investors now have a part dedicated to ESG investing. It could be virtue signaling, but at the same time, it also might mean that they are more passionate and more interested to look at this space, but it will take some time.
From Enterprise Singapore's perspective, we are an enterprise development agency, so we would engage and support companies in the circular solutions or circular economy regardless of the matrices. But we do have an investment arm, Seeds Capital, that invests in tech startups, including areas within the circular economy and sustainability. We are more a thematic investor rather than a impact investor, so we don't really rely on certain investment matrices. But we do look at opportunities, areas within water monitoring and solutions, energy, renewable energy, food technologies. And a lot of these areas are also aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, right, as thematics. One point, of course, is that we do invest alongside private sector venture capitalists, a number of them, and we're beginning to see more VCs that are more impact-focused and very focused on sustainability. And each of them have their own matrices that they rely on. Within our ecosystem, investors like Trirac, Wavemaker Impact, Emerald Ventures in the area of water, right? So these are partners that we invest alongside to deploy investments into startups in the space.
Okay. Yeah. I think we can take one question at this point. There's one coming in about S&G seeming to play just supporting roles for E. At the end of the day, is it all about the E, or do the social and governance side of things deserve more attention? Why are we so focused on the environment, essentially?
Well, maybe I'll jump on this. No, I think eventually we would need to look at all three aspects, right? Environment, social governance. I think right now, of course, the environmental issues are probably a lot more evident and pressing, right? With all the reports on the waste generation, I think stats like World Bank's statistics that our global waste is going to increase by 70% by 2050. I think all this just creates a focus in this environmental area, and of course the impact on climate change. Measurability, I think, is another reason that I'm hearing, right? It's a lot easier to measure and quantify the impact on the environmental space as compared to the social and governance. So perhaps that's why there is an increased focus on the environmental side. And of course with green finance picking up steam amongst regulators as well as the financiers. But I do think that the social and governance part are just as important. Yeah.
Okay. Joyce, if I could come back to, sorry, would you like to add something to this?
Well, I think just to sort of maybe give a little bit of perspective is that we all live on one Earth,
yeah,
and we all have just one Earth to care about. But when it comes to the S, depending on which region of the world you are in, the S is very different. The S concerns and issues that you have is very different. And so it's easier to unite people for that E than the S. I think that's why.
Okay. I want to come back to the point of multiples. How much are investors willing to pay up for waste technologies at this point? What are the multiples you're seeing in Europe or the US?
Well, if you compare Asia versus, the West, I think it's still quite different. A lot more of the capital that impact investors are deploying right now are still in the early stage side of things, because it is still very nascent in Asia. You do have a lot more companies that are investing in, let's say, seed to Series A, but in US and in Europe, then you have a lot more growth stage capital that's deploying funds towards circularity companies. And it's simply a matter of just the fact that we are still in a very nascent stage.